Well, welcome to the webinar today. We're going to talk about identifying the nutrient deficiency symptoms. As Brian mentioned, my name is Brian Krug. I used to be at the University of New Hampshire for about 8 years, but about a year and a half, 2 years ago, I left the university system and took a job with DuPont Pioneer here in Iowa. I'm doing very much of the same stuff that I was doing at the University of New Hampshire, just with a private company, and I work with corn primarily instead of ornamental plants. But my heart still lies with ornamental plants, so I get the opportunity to interact with you guys and growers through e-GRO. So I'm excited to be here offering this webinar today. So as Brian mentioned, we're going to get through this. Please type in questions that you have. If Brian feels that it's necessary, he might interrupt and stop me to answer a question, but by and large, we'll get those questions answered at the end. So the handout that I had put on the website is a kind of a worksheet for you guys. And so one of the handouts, I also have should have the slide set, so you have the slide set. If that's not up right now, we will have it available to you. But the worksheet is there to let you follow along and hopefully helps you learn these nutrient deficiency symptoms. I know for me, it was a hard thing for me to kind of get through, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. So when we look at identifying nutrient deficiency symptoms, there's a process here. First, we have to know the symptoms, and that's what we're going to focus on today. That's the primary focus of today's talk. Once we know the symptoms, we need to think about the causes because we want to fix the problem. We're not going to go through these causes today, but there are resources on e-GRO, and then I would suspect some of the other webinars this week will also cover some of those things. And learning that process of identifying the symptoms and the causes and putting it into practice. I think in my own experience, when I was a grower and then starting out as an extension specialist, I'd be out with other faculty or extension specialists or really experienced growers, and they would see some of these symptoms and they would know right away what that symptom is. And it really appeared that they were just being able to pull those symptoms and those answers out of the air just with a snap of fingers. And what I'm going to try and do today is show you that that's not true. There's a process, and we put that into practice. And when we put that into practice over time, that process happens very quickly in our mind. And I think that all of you can get there with this system that I'm going to lay out today. As I mentioned, we're going to talk about the symptoms primarily today. So we're going to talk about recognizing the nutrient deficiency symptoms, breaking it down by mobile elements, partially mobile elements, and immobile elements. But before I get any farther, I want to go through some vocabulary that I'm going to be using because it can be a little bit confusing if we're not all on the same page. First of all, what is a mobile element? And this really tripped me up a lot when I started first learning about nutrient deficiencies and plant nutrition, because all the elements, they're moving through the plant, so they're all mobile, right? Well, yes, but when we talk about mobile elements, we're talking about elements that can be reallocated. Once they've been deposited into a leaf of the plant, can they be moved back into a different part of the plant that is needing that element? And that's what we call a mobile element. So they move both directions up and down through the plant. Now, an immobile element is an element that once it gets taken up by the plant and deposited into the leaf tissue somewhere, used by the plant, it can't be reallocated to another part of the plant. So it's a one-way street. It only goes up once and it can't get moved back down to the plant and reallocated. Chlorosis. Chlorosis is what we talk about when we see a yellowing of the plant, where we're losing some of the green tint of the plant. And there's a couple of different types there. We have the one on the left where we just kind of have this overall chlorosis on the newer tissue shown there. And on the right, that is what we would call interveinal chlorosis, where the veins are still dark green and the tissue in between the veins are turning yellow. That's our chlorosis. Now, necrosis is dead tissue or brown tissue. And here's two good examples. Different symptomology here, but we would call that necrosis, those brown spots on the poinsettia leaf on the left, and then the very brown leaves of the Gerber daisy on the right. Another one is flower deformity. And you can see here with these two flowers that the petals aren't fully formed. They're either not there entirely, or only a few of the petals are there, or the petals are curled or just not laying out flat like we expect them to. Some of this, you need to know what the flower should look like. Some flowers don't have really nice laid out petals, some do. So knowing what crop you're working with is important here as well. Leaf distortion is another term that we use, and it can be a wide range of symptomology here, but basically we're talking about something that's not normal. The color hasn't necessarily changed, but the shape of the leaf is different than what we would expect. It can be like real clubbiness or clustering of the tissue, also like very needle-like leaves on this petunia on the left, or curling of the leaves as we see in the lily on the right. Speckling or flecking, it kind of goes along with necrosis sometimes, but this is just the pattern of the necrosis on the leaves. Sometimes we see like marginal chlorosis. Other times we'll see just kind of like a dotting or the speckling or flecking on the leaves. Now that we've gone through the kind of the terminology that I'm going to be using, I'm just going to set you up a little bit of what we're going to be doing. We're going to be using really a dichotomous key for figuring out what the nutrient deficiencies are. And many of you might be familiar with dichotomous keys when you've keyed out what a flower is or a tree is, or if you're a birder, like what kind of bird it is. And really what these books do is it asks you a question and it has two answers, and that will kind of choosing your own adventure down one of those two answers that will get you to another question that will again have two answers to try to narrow it down, and eventually you'll come to one answer based on the questions that are asked of you in the book, or the dichotomous key. We're going to take a very similar approach with nutrient deficiencies. But before we start getting into the nutrient deficiencies, we need to ask ourselves the right questions. And the first question that I always ask myself is, am I really looking at a nutrient deficiency? It might look like one, but I need to determine, is it really a nutrient deficiency? So this is where our dichotomous key starts. Is it really a nutrient deficiency? Yes or no? We need to figure that out. And how I do that is looking for patterns or the lack of patterns within a crop or a plant. When we look at symptoms and there's no pattern in the crop, there's no pattern on the leaves, if there's no pattern within the greenhouse or in the crop, usually it's an insect or a disease, a biotic factor, something that's living and can move around, follows kind of a path, but doesn't necessarily have a pattern. Now, a nutrient disorder or an environmental problem, or what we call abiotic problems, usually has a consistent pattern throughout the greenhouse. And if you think about it, your nutrients are usually delivered by a fertilizer, and everything in the greenhouse is treated similarly. So if it's going to have a nutrient problem, it's going to be affecting everything and will have a consistent pattern through the greenhouse. A nice kind of way to check this is, here's a line drawing of a leaf. If we fold this leaf down the middle in like a book, does that pattern match up on both sides of those leaves, or is it a little bit more random? And if we were to fold this in half, not all these lesions would match up. So we would have something with no pattern or a biotic factor. And in this case, it's a disease. Now, with this leaf, if we were to fold that in half like a book, you would see that for the most part it matches up. And it's not going to be a perfect match always, but we have this marginal lesions on the leaf, and if we fold that, they, for the most part, match up. Now that leads me to believe that it's going to be an environmental or a nutritional problem or an abiotic disorder. So we can look at this in real life, and here's a crop in a greenhouse, and we look down the greenhouse bay, and we see somewhat of a pattern here. Everything on the right-hand part of the picture is showing some chlorosis. It's a little bit yellow. Everything on the left hand is normal and green. So now it's not across the entire greenhouse, but when we start investigating a little bit more, these are on automatic irrigation, and the feed line that's providing the irrigation water for the plants on the right is coming from a different injector than the one on the left. So there is a pattern within how the plants are being cared for. In this case, the injector on the right was not working properly, not providing enough nutrition to the plants, and you can see that very clear-cut delineation between those two zones in the irrigation, but that pattern over that one zone is very consistent. Look at another example. These petunias in a pot. We've got two of the cuttings that look pretty good. One that's completely dead and another that's on its way out. There's no real pattern here. It's fairly random. So this is a good example of a biotic disorder. It's a disease. It starts in one place and it's moving out. If we came back a week later, we would probably see that the disease has taken hold in all the plants in the pot. And if we looked at this in the entire crop, you'd probably find that it started in one pot and moved out from that one pot, but it's not affecting the entire crop. Another example here, this is a genetic disorder where, again, we don't have that symmetry in the plant, so we know that it's probably not an abiotic disorder. It's not a nutrient deficiency or an environmental problem. Just going through a lot of examples here to get that repetition so you guys start to recognize this. Here, again, we don't see any symmetry. We have one plant that's completely died there in the center, and you can kind of see that it's moving out in a concentric ring from that one plant, that other plants around it are starting to get affected. But if we were to zoom out, you would see that there's only one spot and there's no real symmetry in the entire crop. Here with marigolds, we're starting to see some symmetry again, not necessarily on the whole plant, but when we look at the leaves, we're seeing that those leaves on the lower part of the leaf, and there's a pattern. It's not the whole plant, it's just a portion of the plant, but all of the plants are showing the same symptoms, and they're all yellowing. The leaves are consistently yellow on the bottom part of the plant, so that is pointing towards a nutritional or an environmental parameter. So now that we've asked, are we really dealing with a nutrient deficiency, and we're getting comfortable with determining, is it an abiotic or a biotic issue that we're really dealing with? It's like, where do we see the symptoms is our next question. And we need to really be honest with ourselves, because the question really is, where do we see the symptoms first? Are we paying a close attention to our crops where we start to see the symptoms when they start appearing? That is the key here. If it happens at the base of the plant, like in the picture of those marigolds, that tells us that we're dealing with a mobile nutrient. The plant reallocates the nutrients to the newer, younger tissue at the expense of the older, more mature tissue when there's a lack of nutrients available to the plant. And the typical, and here's a typical response here. You see that the top part of the plant is nice, lush, and green, but the bottom part of the plant is progressively getting chlorotic. If it's at the top of the plant, that is indicating that we're dealing with an immobile element. It's not reallocating those nutrients from the lower leaves up to the top of the plant, so our symptoms show up at the top of the plant. This is a very classic example with Calibrachoa. And this is iron deficiency. Most of you probably know this one quite well, but the symptoms come out at the top of the plant. Now you need to be a little bit careful here, because in this hanging basket, it doesn't necessarily mean that the symptoms are coming from the top or are present at the top of the container, but the top of the plant or the growing point of the plant. And as we know how Calibrachoa grows, it's a little bit more viney. It can droop if it's not supported. So we have to look at the plant, not the container. And finally, if the deficiency symptoms are showing up in the middle of the plant or uniformly through the whole plant, we're probably dealing with a partially mobile element. Now we need to be careful here, because remember what I said, where did the symptoms start? If the symptoms started 2 weeks ago and we have our blinders on and we're not paying attention, eventually those symptoms will show up on the entire plant. So we need to be paying attention to, where do the symptoms start? If the symptoms start in the middle of the plant or uniformly across the whole plant, we're dealing with a partially mobile element. So here's an example with sulfur, that the plant that's healthy on the left is nice and green. The plant on the right is a little bit stunted and evenly chlorotic, evenly lighter green across the entire plant. Now we need to look at what symptoms are we seeing, what exactly is showing up on the leaves. And that is going to be the key to the final question that we're going to ask ourselves in recognizing the nutrient deficiency symptoms. So, we have a multitude, almost a dozen different elements that we might see in the greenhouse that have nutrient deficiencies. And that's where it starts to get really tricky, because we're going to say, like, what you see, people who are practiced at this, they'll look at something and say, like, oh, that's magnesium deficiency. And it appears like they're just pulling magnesium deficiency out of the air. But the first question they asked themselves is, where is it showing up? Is it mobile, partially mobile, or immobile? And this drastically narrows down our field. So let's look at the mobile elements first. And if we determine that it's a mobile element, we've just limited our possibilities to 4 different elements, making our lives a whole lot easier. So when you look at what the symptoms are, and if chlorosis is your main symptom happening early on the mobile, or the base of the plant, we're probably looking at nitrogen or phosphorus. That's our main symptom that we look at, is chlorosis early on. Now, when we look at this, nitrogen versus phosphorus, and we look at all the different symptoms of nitrogen and phosphorus, we kind of see a lot of the same of elements. And that's something else that has always tripped me up a lot in the past, is that you start to see a lot of the same things. So, severe stunting, possibly purpling, possible red, chlorosis. But when I first learned this, in a classroom, the professor had listed off all the nutrient symptoms for nitrogen, and then they went to phosphorus, and by and large they said the same things, and that got very confusing and hard for me to really decipher what I needed to be paying attention to, until finally it was presented to me in a different way of looking for what's different. Okay, we know that it's a mobile element. We know that it's uniformly chlorosis, which brings us on the lower leaves, so it brings us nitrogen or phosphorus. But what's different about these two? And early flowering and leaf abscission is what's different about nitrogen. A slightly deeper green foliage and roots that are longer, and there's fewer of them for phosphorus. So let's look at nitrogen deficiency. And here we see on this violet that the younger or the older leaves are more more chlorotic. But then if we look up at the salvia picture, we notice that now they're starting to turn necrotic. That oldest leaf, the one in the upper left-hand corner of that top picture, is starting to turn necrotic over time. And That's one thing with nitrogen deficiency is it's chlorosis followed by necrosis. We have early flowering or severe stunting. So these plants are the same age, and you can see that there's more fully open plants on the nitrogen deficient plant. And clearly it's much smaller. So those are the keys that we want to look for nitrogen, telling the difference between nitrogen and phosphorus. Now with phosphorus, again, we're going to focus on that deeper green foliage and the longer, fewer roots. And if you're a plug producer, this is something that you probably know quite well. We actually use this to our advantage to get more compact plants and a deeper green in our crop by limiting phosphorus. But there's a limit to what we can do. If we limit phosphorus too much, we'll start to see some of the other symptoms. But if we're seeing more compact plants and a deeper green than some of our other plants, and we know that we haven't used any PGRs, we might be thinking towards phosphorus deficiency. And then that lower leaf chlorosis and the purpling is one of those telltale signs of phosphorus deficiency as well. It happens in nitrogen deficiency, but not quite to the extent that you would see it in phosphorus deficiency. And if you can look at the roots, and I always advise growers and my staff, the first thing that they need to do with looking at any plant problem is look at the roots. And if you look at the roots, now these were hydroponically grown in this picture, but you can usually see this in a pot if it's been established in that pot. But the control plant that had no nutrient deficiency symptoms has a nice, well-branched, developed roots. On the phosphorus deficient plant on the right, those roots are longer, and there's very, very few branches associated with those, and you can usually see that in the pot. Now, we'll go to our next symptom, and we first looked at uniform chlorosis, and that's going to be nitrogen or phosphorus. If we see interveinal chlorosis at the bottom of the plant, our life really got easy. It's magnesium. There's no other symptom that shows up. There's no other element that shows symptoms on the lower leaves and has interveinal chlorosis. So as I mentioned, older leaves, as this progresses over time, we might get some necrosis, but that's a very well advanced case of magnesium deficiency, and we might see some possible red leaves. And those bottom two also are similar to nitrogen and phosphorus in some ways, but that interveinal chlorosis on the older leaves is what we need to pay attention to for magnesium. Here's some examples. Here on the chrysanthemums on the right-hand picture, very classic. Just the lower leaves are showing the symptoms, and it's a very distinct interveinal chlorosis. The veins, the midrib of those leaves are dark green, and we have the chlorosis in between. And a little bit more subtle on the left-hand picture there, but it will progress, and you see it'd be a little bit more clear over time. And our final mobile element is potassium. So if you don't see any other, or if you see necrosis and it rapidly goes necrotic on the lower part of the plant, we're looking at potassium more than likely. Now let's look at the symptoms there. I'll bring those in, and the chlorosis, we've seen chlorosis on the other ones, but again, it's the rapid necrosis of margins or spotting across the older leaf blades. And with this one, you'll rarely see the chlorosis. You're going to have to be looking really, really closely to see the chlorosis. If you go out there and it seems like overnight the plants went from green to having some necrotic spots on the plants, and you know that it didn't dry out overnight or have any drought stress, we start looking at potassium because drought stress we'd probably see throughout the entire plant, not just the older leaves, or even more at the top of the plant. So we just start narrowing these down. And this is what I'm talking about here on the begonia on the upper left-hand corner. You see that band of necrotic spots across the top of the leaf, and then also along the margins on some of these other crops as well. Poinsettia, very classic with the necrotic on the margin of the leaf. Really not a lot of necrosis anywhere else, just very defined on the edge of those leaves. So that wraps up our mobile elements, and hopefully you've started to see how I'm breaking this down to make our decision making much easier. I'm not looking at all the nutrient deficiencies and trying to decide which one it is. It's always a process of elimination. I decided that it was mobile. Now I only have 4 different elements to look at. This time we're going to look at partially mobile, and it makes it even easier. We have 2 to choose from if we're having symptoms evenly across the entire plant or just in the middle of the plant. It's either sulfur or molybdenum, and it's going to get even easier as I get through here. So let's look at sulfur. Is uniform chlorosis on the entire plant. It can go necrotic over time if it goes too far. The flower colors will be faded, and the internodes in the leaves might develop some red pigmentation. Again, necrosis isn't new, chlorosis isn't new, and having some red pigmentation on the plant also isn't new. So let's look at what is really different. And that's going to be the faded flower colors. And we're still going to look at the chlorosis, but it's more so all the way through the uniformness throughout the whole plant. So this is what it looks like in real life. You know, we have some stunted plants. So we had stunted plants in the nitrogen, but the difference here with the sulfur versus the nitrogen is the nitrogen came in at the lower part of the plant first, whereas the sulfur is over the entire plant very evenly. This is a little bit more rare in very severe cases where we do get some necrosis of the tips moving its way down the plant, but this one is a symptom that you probably won't see quite as often. The other symptom was that you know, we do have some chlorosis of the younger leaves with the mesia, and it can get a little bit trickier because nothing ever really shows up in a perfect system, in a biological system. But what I'm going to focus on with the nemesia is the flowers. If I start looking close at the flowers, we start to notice that the sulfur deficient flowers are faded, and so are the stems. The stems are faded as well. Now, this requires us to know the cultivars that we're growing really well. You know, the shades of purple that we might see in any one of our species, depending on the cultivar that we're growing, might be very varied. But if we know that we're growing a dark purple colored flower and we're getting a nice light lavender, we might need to know that something's up. Now, molybdenum, again, is a partially mobile element. And it's really easy because if you don't grow poinsettias, if you're an ornamental grower and you don't grow poinsettias, you probably won't ever see molybdenum. It's really only a problem in poinsettias in ornamental growth or ornamental flower plants. Now, if you're growing some food crops like some of the greens, you might see some molybdenum come up in some of your other crops. But you get a clear chlorotic band on the leaf margin, and then it rapidly goes to chlorosis, moving inward from the leaf margin. So this is just the very beginning of it on a poinsettia crop. You notice on the edges of the poinsettia leaf, we're starting to see just this clear band of chlorosis, and this will start to get a little bit more pronounced as the molybdenum deficiency progresses. And it will go necrotic, which could look like potassium, but this is at the middle part of the plant, not the lower leaf. You notice, you can see the lower leaves in the background of this photo, and they look very healthy. There's no chlorotic band around the edge of those leaves. Finally, let's go to the non-mobile elements, and those are probably some of the harder ones because there's the most to choose from. We have 6 to choose from instead of 4 or 2. So let's work through those one by one. So We know that if it's immobile in nutrients, the symptoms are going to come up at the top. If we have chlorosis at the top of the plant or the tip of the plant, again, we're looking at the tip of the growing point, not necessarily the top of the container, as I mentioned with Calibre, but that's going to look at either iron or manganese. So now we've narrowed it down to 2 instead of 6. If we have necrosis or distortion at the top of the plant, we're going to look at calcium or boron. And if we have the young and recently mature leaves affected, it's probably going to be copper or zinc. So now we just broke this down, just looking at 3 different symptoms or places where these symptoms show up, and we've gone from 6 down to 2, depending on where these symptoms are showing up or what the symptom is. Let's focus on iron and manganese first. So I already said that we have chlorosis on the youngest part of the plant. It's going to be interveinal, more than likely. It's going to be uniform or marginal on the leaves. And looking at these symptoms, what's different from these? And the chlorosis is the same. So we're going to focus on the chlorosis that turns to yellow or white and then becomes necrotic. Or we're going to look at tan flecking. Iron deficiency is probably, if there's one deficiency symptom that almost every grower can pick out from across the greenhouse, iron deficiency is probably it. It's probably the one that we deal with most readily in ornamental growing. So this is probably not new to you guys, seeing this interveinal chlorosis on the top of the plant. Again, if you look kind of in the background of these pictures, especially with the petunias, you see that the lower leaves are not showing any symptoms. It's the uppermost part of the plant. Now, things like Gerber daisies, they kind of make it a little bit difficult for us because all the leaves come from the base of the plant in a rosette. So we need to look at those inner leaves, the youngest leaves, because those are the newest ones. We get a little bit of a curveball there. Looking at molybdenum, we're looking at that tan flecking again, and here's some great pictures of that tan flecking. Very similar to one of our mobile elements, but the difference is being that we're seeing at the top of the plant. But we're seeing very similar symptoms on individual leaves, but where we're seeing it on the plant is different. This flecking across the leaf blade, and we know that we haven't had any spray damage or anything like that. It's probably manganese deficiency. Now let's move on to calcium and boron, where we see the necrosis and distortion. Very similar symptoms. So as I've been beating this drum all along, let's look at what's different. We're going to have shorter internodes with the boron deficiency. Oftentimes, it's almost going to look like the plant is in a rosette. The leaves are going to be very thick and brittle. Sometimes there'll be kind of like a corkiness to them. If you try to bend them, they'll usually break, as opposed to being flexible that we normally would see at least a non-succulent plant. And we'll see abortion of the growing tip, and prolific branching on the lower lateral internodes. But let's look at calcium. So calcium, we also have this distortion of the leaves that's oftentimes going to go to necrosis pretty quick. One real telltale sign that I use for calcium is these pictures on the left, up on the top and the bottom. It almost looks as if there's a drawstring at the base of these leaves, and somebody just pulled on that drawstring, and those leaves just kind of cupped up or curled. The distortion caused by the calcium deficiency, and this plant there on the bottom right, very similar. It's just all happening like it's all puckered up at the very tip, and we get some necrosis following in very shortly after we see these cupping or puckering of the leaves. We also see incomplete flower development, fewer petals, misformed petals. If you cut open the flower, you might see some necrosis in the middle of there. And a lot of us might be more familiar with calcium deficiency in tomatoes or blossom end rot. It's very common. Most of us are accustomed to seeing that, or cork spot on apple. Also calcium deficiency. It's that necrosis showing up, and sometimes that malformation at the end of the growing point of the plant. The primary and secondary roots are oftentimes shorter. There might be the same amount of roots. They're just more compact than what you would normally see. Again, pulling that plant out of the pot, looking at the roots is something that I advise everybody to do as one of their first things that they use when they're looking at plant problems. With boron, I talked about the rosetting and the thick leaves, and I want to show you some example of that, as well as some incomplete petal formation. Here it is in pansies, where we know we should be growing this nice big yellow flower, but instead we're having this bleached out white flower that has that same cupping that we saw in the leaves. Incomplete flower stem formation. This is a picture of cut tulips where the tulips just fell under their weight of the bloom, and those cells in the flower stem just did not fully form, and they're not able to keep that flower upright. Here's one that is probably one of the more common symptoms on pansies. We also see this a lot on Gerber daisies and petunias. This is probably where most of you guys have witnessed boron deficiency. And you can see here with this pansy plant, it's that rosetting that I'm talking about, that distortion. It's very similar distortion that you see with calcium, but there's no necrosis associated with it. I've actually done a lot of work with boron deficiency, and all the times that I induced this, I never saw necrosis on the plants, where side by side inducing the calcium deficiency, almost every time we got some necrosis on those tips. Here's that corkiness. You can see that cork layer forming on the leaves of the youngest leaf tissue. When we look at the roots, we have probably we have shorter and fewer roots, and those ones that are there are thick and they're highly branched. I could talk for a couple of hours on boron deficiency, but I don't want to bore you guys too much, so I'll keep moving. That brings us to our last two, and it's copper and zinc. And these might be the two that I struggle with the most, mostly because I haven't seen them that much in the greenhouse with ornamental crops as much as I've seen all the other ones that I've talked about. So looking at the symptoms side by side, both of them, the leaves curl, some variable chlorosis, rapid necrosis on the young leaves. So that's what's similar about them. So let's look at what's different about them. We have smaller, lighter colored flowers, or no flowers at all, with the copper. So here's our leaves that are curling, some distortion, nothing that's really pulling this out to tell us that it's copper. But now we look at the flowers, and we see again that really clear discoloration of the flower. And again, just like with sulfur, we need to know what we're growing, and knowing what color we expect. The flower on the left-hand side of this picture is attractive and a nice color, but it's not the one that it's supposed to be from the cultivar that we have purchased and are growing. So knowing that the difference. Sometimes they're smaller to not having any flowers at all. And here's the control versus the copper deficient. We don't have any flowers on the ones on the right. These are the same age. They're much stunted, but we're not seeing those symptoms that we might have seen with other stunted crops, like or the other elements like nitrogen or sulfur, where we don't see any chlorosis on those leaves. Copper deficiency, sometimes we see a sudden dieback of the most recently matured leaves. So here's some roses growing, and where the hand is being held there on the top of the plant, you see that the stem is pretty much bare, but there's leaves below it and there's some leaves above it. So that oftentimes happens with copper deficiency. Let's look at zinc now, our final nutrient deficiency. And we get curling or chlorosis of the young leaves. Sometimes we get the shorter internodes. The plant on the right is nutrient deficient in zinc, and we're having that shorter internodes. And on the plant on the far left, that's also zinc deficient, and we're losing some of those leaves in the middle. The plant in the middle is a control plant. Zinc deficiency is not something that we commonly see in ornamentals. I want to make you aware of it, but it's a little bit more rare. If you guys want to see some more very specific nutrient deficiencies for a good array of commonly grown bedding plants in the greenhouse industry, I really recommend this book, Nutrient Deficiencies in Bedding Plants. And this is a full color book where it shows, I want to say about a dozen, Brian can correct me, different common bedding plants, and shows induced symptomology for each one of the elements. You can buy this on Amazon.com. Right now, it's probably the only place that you can find it. It's really expensive on Amazon. We're talking hundreds of dollars because it's out of print. So it's just resellers that are selling it. e-GRO, the e-GRO group, a couple of the individuals on e-GRO has a whole bunch of these. And we're working on a way to get them distributed, set things up so that we can take payment and ship these out. So pay attention to e-GRO alerts and the e-GRO website over the next year sometime. We hope to have that available to all of you, so just stay tuned, and we'll try to become a distributor of these books at a much more reasonable cost for growers. That's all I have for you guys today. Hopefully you were able to follow along with that handout and get your key filled out.